Now it's time to talk about planetary boundaries, and the origin of the concept as we know it today began with two articles, both coming out in 2009. One in the journal Ecology and Society, about a 30-page long article which had a very strong natural science orientation, and then a shorter, somewhat more summary kind of article with a more transdisciplinary kind of nature in the journal Nature. It was only about 4 pages long. The idea behind the planetary boundaries concept is that we need to understand what are, as they referred to at the time, the safe operating boundaries of humanity. What pressure we place on the system called the Earth, how much pressure we can put on it without there becoming serious problems. The authors of these articles posited that there were 9 boundaries, and some of you may be familiar with seeing this kind of diagram from 2009 and later versions of it. They suggested the boundaries in some of these areas, and in other areas they knew that there were boundaries, but they weren't sure what they would be. They were just guesses at the time. This was a multidisciplinary team that put together this article. And we can see a picture here of some of the members of the team. The team in some ways was headed by Johan Rockström and by Will Steffen. And these two became particularly those people associated with promoting the idea. Depending upon where in the world, maybe you have associated that one with Rockström or one with Steffen. At the time, in 2009, there were 3 boundaries which the authors suggested that humanity had transgressed or gone past. And what were these? These were in the biogeochemical boundary, the nitrogen cycle. We also have a biodiversity boundary, and we have a climate change boundary. Those are the 3 of the 9 where humanity has completely gone beyond those boundaries that would be the safe operating space for humanity. Now these boundaries are presented as, initially, at least in the diagram, as if they are succinct areas, that there's no overlap between them. But when you read the articles, you understand that the authors are saying that there are clear interlinkages between all the boundaries. That if we begin to push too much and exceed a boundary in one sector, in one area, then what will happen is that that will start to impact on other activities and amplify the effect or change the positions of the boundaries, perhaps in a sense lowering the boundaries or in some ways changing them. At the time, the authors of the study emphasized that this was a rough, best first guess or estimate as to what certain values they should be. And that more knowledge would be required to sort of bridge the gap in knowledge and to change the amount of uncertainty that might exist. However, based on this idea of boundaries, the idea was to try to say that, look, in the past there have been efforts to make changes. There have been efforts in terms of each sector that we make some sort of changes to minimize impact, and yet we can continue to have economic development. And they're saying that, okay, we're presenting it in such a way that it looks like there are individual kinds of boundaries. This is for pedagogical kind of reasons. They actually are clearly linked together. Another key message was that if we want to avoid at a global scale the results of human-induced change, then we have to stay within these boundaries. But they set the boundaries at a level which was a bit lower than what they referred to as the thresholds. The threshold values are those that they're quite sure that we're in a dangerous area. And by setting the boundaries somewhat below that, so to speak, it was an attempt to use what we could call the precautionary principle. Although, at least in 2009, they really weren't using the concept of the precautionary principle by name in the articles per se, but it was a way to have some sort of a cushion because of their uncertainty. However, as they say, it's up to you, it's up to organizations, it's up to society as a whole, and you as a particular person to decide what are the risks, what is the uncertainty, and what are the consequences. They have set the boundaries. Are we going to think of these risks and consequences and then try to follow the boundaries? Or do we think that this isn't so much of a problem and, okay, we'll just continue with business as usual? It is a societal issue, they ultimately say, particularly in the article in Nature, which is more transdisciplinary. They emphasize that. Now, in some ways, the idea of planetary boundaries is nothing new. This isn't the first time that we have had a group of researchers that have been looking at what we could refer to the Earth as a system and about human interactions with vital functions. In the early 1970s, there was an influential book which was called Limits to Growth, and this was written by a team of 4 researchers, Donella Meadows, Dennis Meadows, Jürgen Randus, and Willem Barons. These 4 researchers were brought together, in a sense, by Jay Forrester when they were all at MIT in the United States. And what they did was they established a number of different models of the planet Earth, but also models of human society. And they had a variety of parameters like energy, agriculture, population, natural resources, and so forth. And they put all of these parameters into some sort of a model or models, and they adjusted sort of assumptions, and then they crunched the numbers. And out came a number of, for the 1970s at least, interesting printouts, as they looked like. And you're seeing examples of some of these now. And regardless of how they tweaked things in their scenarios and their assumptions, what they ended up with was that at some point in the 2000s, in this century where we have 2024, that society and the planet was going to hit a crash, or it's going to hit a wall. This might be a sort of a slow motion kind of crash, but it was going to happen. Now you could make some changes, and then you would see that maybe it wouldn't be so dire, maybe it would take a longer period of time, maybe it would be possible to achieve some kind of stability, but because of the system and the feedback loops and the limitations and so forth, sooner or later we were going to run into problems. Now, the book received some kind of criticism, or friendly criticism, or we could say it was actually attacked at the time. And this could be attacked because of vested interests. And these vested interests could be in multinational corporations, or could be in smaller companies that felt threatened by this, but it could also be politicians in the political sphere and so forth. It could also be of purely ideological reasons. If you have an ideology that say that there's no limits to economic growth of any kind, then obviously something like this would be something that would be questioning your ideology very seriously. It also was that it questioned the consumerism and lifestyle of those people who are rich or in the middle classes. If we would want to try to put this in today's 2024 kind of terminology, but these weren't exactly the kind of words that would have been used in 1972 or approximately then, the attack would be on the idea that those of us in the global north would have to voluntarily give up some of our affluence so that those in the global south would have a chance to have a life with greater dignity and a greater standard of living. Also, to achieve some sort of balance, to be able to avoid the worst kind of scenarios in this limits to growth, we would need some sort of major restructuring of the entire global economy, to use this kind of terminology today we might be using. Now, whatever they were going to do, these 4 researchers, there's going to be a bit of a problem. The model was crude. There was lacking of some information. It was based on certain assumptions. Regardless, it served as some kind of a warning. Yeah, now as time progressed, the narrative changed a bit. What we could see is that limits to, some would say, later, maybe in the 1980s, surveying the situation then, yes, limits to growth was a warning, and it was an important timely warning, because this meant that there were certain decisions that were made which meant that the worst possible scenarios didn't seem to be that they were going to be occurring as soon, so we avoid these or they get shifted into the future. But there was other kinds of narratives that were critical, but also providing some sort of a nuance. And one of these had to do with technological innovation, that the model in the 1970s didn't take that into consideration. It was much more of a, shall we say, a general societal model and a model having to do with ecology of the planet. So without having sufficient technological dynamism in the model, as one resource becomes scarce, through some kind of innovations, resources that require less of that or could use another kind of resource which was less scarce would come into play, which would mean that some of the lack of natural resources in the limits to growth model, there wasn't that much pressure to those resources. And therefore that changed some of the dynamics of the model in ways that were not predicted in the original book from the 1970s. Another possibility would be to say that not only do we make resource swaps one for another, that we could take waste and through recycling, enough recycling, then that we would have less of demand on new resources. Or if we can't get recycling into new materials, we could burn the waste, meaning less demand on energy. And these kinds of things that were suggested were not considered in the original model from the 1970s. So there is human ingenuity, and the global economy can adapt to certain things given enough time, would be the argument that we made. And this latter narrative, we can see, feeds into some of the ideas that we hear in the ideas of ecological modernization, which gained some sort of currency beginning in the 1990s and onwards. That we can avoid a number of these problems. We can have some kind of economic development and protect the environment at the same time. Environmental protection isn't something that is a problem for modern society. It's actually a very important part of modern society, ecological modernization. So let's move back to planetary boundaries. Did this idea just pop out of somebody's head or a group of people in a conference, that the idea just sort of appeared like that? No. As in so many cases, the work of one scientist builds upon another, or if you trace back some of the work of some of the lead authors in the original studies from 2009, you can see that some of them were on track of this. They were looking at particular areas that are boundaries, and they were also looking at the interlinkages between them in specific locations or the like. So the idea had some sort of a gestation period, and the right combination of researchers at the right time could create the genesis, the origin, the basis of this or the two articles from 2009. And so this sort of hints, by looking in hindsight, looking back at some of the articles, it sort of hints that there's going to be a concept at some point that will be developed, planetary boundaries. What are some other important messages that we can see from reading these articles from 2009? Well, they give practical examples of interlinkages that can have human effects. They suggest, for example, if there is enough land use changes in a place in the world like in the Amazon, this will tend to make changes in atmospheric patterns, distribution of moisture, and so forth. And ultimately, this could lead to changes in the availability of water resources in a place like Tibet. They can't say for sure that's going to happen, but that would be an example of something that might occur with the interlinkages between the planetary boundaries. And as we push in one area, there can be effects in another area. How about phosphorus? In 2009, they were just concerned about, they were just saying that the nitrogen cycle was being exceeded, but what about the phosphorus cycle? It's not just a question about peak phosphorus, that we're running out of the possible use of phosphor in agriculture, for example. It's also a question of too much phosphor is ending up flowing into the oceans. Then they know, or based on past events with higher amounts of phosphor in the oceans, then there can be mass extinctions of a variety of marine life forms. And then finally, the area of biological diversity, a boundary which they say we have crossed, but it's very difficult to know an exact value because certain ecosystems have a greater biological diversity than others, and what would be at the global level, what kind of value, what kind of indicator would we need to have there? Because as we put pressure on a number of ecosystems around the world, a greater amount of biological diversity could mean a more robust ecosystem. And by pulling out the biological diversity, this would mean that ecosystems are more susceptible to pressures that we put on in the other kinds of boundaries that we have. And these ecosystems are very important, and if they're disturbed too much, they can cross certain thresholds. Not only would it be that nature, so to speak, is affected by a deteriorating ecosystem, but there are ecosystems where humans are dependent upon those functioning systems for their livelihood and their survival. In the 2009 article in Nature, the one more related to society and policy, the authors say that the two most damaging activities that humans do is our use of fossil fuels to run the economy and other kinds of extractionary purposes with fossil fuels, making plastics, for example. And the other is our modern-day practice of industrial agriculture. Those are not the only two problems. We have transportation and construction and so forth. But they suggest that if we're going to take our first actions, maybe it should be agriculture and fossil fuels. Maybe that's what we should target and then start working on other matters. At least this is what they suspected at the time. So on a slightly more optimistic note, the last sentence in the article in Nature from 2009 says that the evidence so far suggests that as long as the thresholds are not crossed, humanity has the freedom to pursue long-term social and economic development. Since the first Planetary Boundaries article was published in 2009, a number of other articles have been written and published by either some of the original team involved in the first article or by new members of a team. The people involved has changed through time. Some researchers have critiqued the work. For example, some have suggested that some of the boundaries should be some have suggested that some of the boundary categories should be broken into more than one category. So instead of 9 boundaries, why not 7 or 11 or whatever? It seems like there's developed some sort of a convention from 2009 that there should be 9 boundaries. Nash and colleagues in a 2017 article suggest that the planetary boundaries concept has what we could refer to as a terrestrial bias. In other words, given that the planet's surface is mostly water, it seems like that a lot of the boundaries are based on people living on land and not thinking about the planet as a whole, where water is very dominant. Following its notoriety in 2009, the concept of planetary boundaries, mostly developed within a natural science kind of field and discipline, has been forced to, or has opened up to accommodate more social science kinds of concepts. Kate Raworth began talking about Doughnut Economics in about 2002, and her book in 2017 came out, where she sketched out the thoughts in much more detail. In a way, we could see that her Doughnut Economics idea is a complement to the planetary boundaries. When we look at the donut idea, we see that on the outside are the planetary boundaries that Rockström and others have been talking about. So we can see in the model here that we have the outer part and we have the inner part. And the outer is the Earth system boundary, shall we speak of, and the inner part has to do with societal foundations. So the outside of the donut can be thought of as a ceiling that we cannot go beyond, and the inside of the donut is some sort of floor that we cannot sink beneath. So what we see in the 2023 article by Rockstrom and others, which appears in the academic journal Nature, we see now that they have incorporated economic and social thinking. They have understood there's something about, for example, Doughnut Economics that they need to include. So now they speak about quantifying safe and just Earth system boundaries. And so safety, which was so important in 2009, is no longer the only guiding idea. Justice is a guiding idea. In contrast to the 2009 article in Ecology and Society, which was heavily oriented towards natural sciences, we can see that the 2023 article in Nature shows evolution in thinking. What they would have thought in 2009 in the Ecology and Society article as being normative, and therefore something that they should not consider, now Agenda 2030 is given some space. And the authors explicitly connect their work to Doughnut Economics and Sustainable Development Goals. We see this is a very different orientation and perspective, whereas the article in 2009, which also appeared in Nature, they were essentially saying, the authors of the article, similar authors to the one Ecology and Society article, they were saying, essentially, we're just scientists. It's the rest making decisions and accepting what is tolerable risk. That's up to politicians and industry and citizens. Additionally, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the categories in the 2009 article, the boundaries, versus the 2023 article, they're not exactly the same. There's been some sort of a change. We see that the boundaries from the 2009 article listed in Table 1, they're not the same as those in 2023, the 2023 article. What's going on here? I'll let you look at those. I'll let you look at the list. We can see that climate change, atmospheric aerosol loading are the same categories in 2009 and 2023. If you read the articles and you look more specifically at climate issues, you'll see that the boundaries, the way they're expressed, has not remained the same. That's something I can get into in a coming video lecture. And in 2009, clearly atmospheric aerosols were important. They were listed as a boundary, a separate boundary, but they were unsure about what the boundary should be. And now in 2023, after 14 years, they have a clearer boundary. I'm not saying it took them 14 years because there has been research that has occurred between there and articles that have been published. I'm just making the big shift for those 14 years between the original publication and the one in 2023. Additionally, surprisingly, 3 boundaries from 2009 have disappeared. The 2 biochemical flows that were one boundary have now been, perhaps rightly, broken into 2. So nitrogen cycles and phosphorus cycles are each separate boundaries now. Water boundaries have been broken into 3 types, or 3 parameters. And land use change and rate of biodiversity loss appear to still be there from 2009, but they have changed names, or there has been some sort of transformation which has taken place. Now we have boundaries which are called natural ecosystem area and functional integrity. So it seems like there is no longer a one-to-one relationship of core parts of the parameters or boundaries through time. 2009 planetary boundaries versus 2023 Earth system boundaries. Maybe that is an important part of this lecture, an important finding. Of course, on the one hand, it should be expected that a concept introduced, say, in 2009 has had 14 years to develop and make some sort of changes. And understanding about some of the boundaries will change. Perhaps a better kind of boundary parameter, an indicator, will have been chosen as opposed to another one after a lot of scientific debate or further work within the scientific team or teams that have been working on planetary boundaries, or Earth system boundaries as they're called now. However, certain things seem to be a little odd. It seems as if, compared to 2009, we have now abandoned ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, and chemical pollution as separate boundary categories. That's a big difference. Just because chemical pollution has disappeared from the Earth system boundaries as opposed to the planetary boundaries in 2009, that doesn't mean that PFAS has ceased to been a problem. It doesn't mean that microplastics are no longer a problem. It means that through the development of the concepts, they have shifted certain things from one boundary to another, and they have perhaps amalgamated other kinds of boundaries into one, hopefully. But things get a little bit more confusing. Bear with me. In the 2023 article in Table 1, they list 9 ESBs, or Earth System Boundaries. But on Figure 1, which is linked to Table 1 on the page before, there are 8. Making matters still less consistent in the article, in the Quantifying ESBs section, and that is if we remove the supplementary articles, or supplementary material, I should say, from the article, the Quantifying ESB section of the article is the one that is the longest. And in the Quantifying Earth System Boundaries part of the article, there are 6 main titles or rubrics: climate, biosphere, water, nutrients, aerosol pollution, novel entities, and other pollutants. And at the very end of that section, there is a so-called current state title as a subsection. And there they state that 7 of the global scale ESBs, Earth System Boundaries, have been crossed. So there are 6 rubrics or themes, one of which, novel entities and other pollutants, is then not followed up in the table and figure. And the other 5 rubrics these can be mapped, perhaps, onto the 9 category boundaries. Except in Figure 1, where there are only 8 boundary categories. Perhaps you will find the article is confusing and inconsistent as I do when you read the article. It would make more sense to have a much more consistently named tables and figures with the various categories in it, not causing confusion to the reader. They also introduce, but hardly explain well, the idea of sub-global categories or sub-global boundaries. So here's a summary of the things which I just said, which I think are confusing. And perhaps this is what we're witnessing now in the article from 2023. Maybe what we see is it's very difficult for the team behind the article in 2023 to keep together the core of the 2009 concept. We know already that with the exception of a handful of people, most people in the 2023 article are not the ones that were involved in the research and the authorship of the 2009 article. We understand that since 2009 there has been a variety of critiques, and there has been some sort of infusion of thinking about justice and not just the safe operating space for humanity. And so this could mean that it's been rather difficult for the concept to keep up with the change in people working with this and the necessary inclusion of more social issues as opposed to having a solely natural science kind of paper. Perhaps we should stop trying to compare 2009 with 2023. We see that there is a continuity among some authors, and they seem to be trying very hard, but maybe not quite succeeding, in limiting and keeping the number of boundaries to exactly 9. Now it's time to summarize the 3 different video lectures. The Anthropocene is a useful concept despite the fact that the ICS rejected it as a measure of geological time, and that the Anthropocene for geologists is not a successor to the Holocene. Gaia is a concept where we think about the entire planet as a whole. We think about the Earth as one living organism, the sum of a variety of ecosystems and abiotic, non-living parts of the planet. This can be considered a hypothesis or a theory or a paradigm, and there is some discussion within science about which one it is. Then we come to planetary boundaries, or Earth system boundaries as they are more correctly called now since 2023. This is a very laudable and useful attempt in a simple and pedagogical way to attempt to describe the various kinds of categories of human impacts on Gaia. And these impacts then are often in 9 different categories expressed as boundaries. The planetary boundaries are attempting to look at what human impacts are during the late Holocene or the early Anthropocene. Yet none of the concepts that you have learned about in these last 3 lectures is perfect. They all have strengths and weaknesses, and they all have potential to be used. You might need to learn a bit more about them to be able to feel more comfortable with them. And now to the outro, where I list the music that was used, the gear that I have used, thanks and acknowledgements. Thanks for watching. I think you might want to watch this one next, and this is the one that YouTube suggests.